Hi, I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Teleos. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of First Corinthians. Fascinating book full of a lot of information on how to run our personal lives and corporate body life in the church, as well as some great theological passages. We're in one of those great passages right now at the end of First Corinthians chapter 1, talking about the wisdom of God. Paul opens this section talking that God has chosen the what the elites we call the foolish or unwise, the simple people, to spread his word, and have not chosen the elites. And because it's all based on God's wisdom and not man's. So he's chosen the simple people to be his messengers. So then there's a interlude here, a fascinating interlude with some interesting information, starting in verse 22 of chapter 1. In the King James, for the Jews require a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom. So again, for as a connection, these connections between phrases are very important in Greek. The original Greek word here is gar. It's expressing an explanation of the prior verses. So basically, the Jews and Gentiles, thinking that they are above the Christians, demand a sign and wisdom. So the Jews, now remember, in all the major cities, really, as far as we know, in the Roman world, there was a diaspora of Jews, generally a minority, but they were particularly prominent in Corinth. There's a very large synagogue there, so there's a lot of Jewishness in this letter to Corinth. And the Jews wanted a sign, just like it's prophesied in the Old Testament. Part of the presentation of the real Messiah when he would come would be by signs that read Isaiah 61 verses 1 and 2, also in Psalm 35, I believe, and or excuse me, I think Isaiah 35 again, that the coming Messiah would perform these signs. The Jews wanted to see this. And of course, historically, God had showed them signs, particularly under Moses and Elijah. The Greeks, on the other hand, they were all about wisdom. The word for wisdom in the original Greek, Sophia, had the sense of knowledge and practical application of that knowledge. So it wasn't experiential knowledge so much as but real knowledge. So this is why Paul, I think, went to the Acropolis or Agapolis, I think, in Acts 17, and gave a speech trying to appeal to the intellect of Greeks to consider Christ at that time, because he knew what they wanted. Of course, Paul was well versed in the Hellenistic world. So, but Paul says in verse 23, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. So this tells us, despite this, Paul preaches the truth, which is the gospel, no matter what the Jews and the Greeks were wanting. However, they have a problem with this. The Jews, Christ is a stumbling block, as promised in the Old Testament. Read Isaiah 8:14. Messiah will be a stumbling block, and their ears would be made deaf and their eyes blind. A lot of verses say this. Chapter 10 of Isaiah, chapter 6 of Isaiah, verses 9 and 10 is a good example. So the Jews then stumble over Messiah. The word here, stumble, probably doesn't reflect the strength of the word. In the original Greek, it's scandalon. I sort of make it a cognate, the scandal, a big scandal, enough to end somebody's faith. Christ himself used this word a number of times, indicating that somebody would lose and leave their faith. So that's a big deal. The Jews stumbled over Messiah. It was a big scandal to them. The Greeks, they thought it was foolishness because it was beneath their vaunted wisdom. Verse 24. But unto them which are called, again, for a man or woman to become a Christian, they have to be called. Otherwise, left to a man's own devices, they will not come to Christ. Romans 3, verses 10 to 12. Good example. We know John 6:44. God has to drag those who will come to him to himself. So those which are called, both Jews and Greeks, otherwise they're both equal now. Ephesians 2, the Jews are not, they don't have precedent over the Greeks. They're equal, one man in the sight of God. Ephesians 2:15. Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. I'll repeat this. Christ is the power, like the power of the gospel in Romans 1:16 and 17, and the wisdom of God. So he's the real wisdom, not the Greek wisdom. He's the power and the salvation. Okay, interesting information. Let's review. The Jews typically have rejected Christ, wanting a sign, and they think that Messiah ends up being a stumbling block to them. No surprise, this was promised by God in the Old Testament. The Greeks want wisdom, and they think Christianity is foolishness. You still see that today. The elites, the globalists in the Gentile world call us stupid, unlearned, biased, racist, all sorts of words to put us down. They don't want to consider the information. Yet the gospel is what we preach, and it's the power of God, the salvation is the wisdom of God. Thanks be to God. Okay, thank you for joining me today. We'll continue this amazing passage next time. I hope you'll join me then.